I'm going to welcome us one more time to supporting students and staff in the aftermath of crisis and loss. We are really happy to have the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, led by David Schoenfeld, who will be guiding us through the conversation today. As you may have heard me mention, my name is Leora, and I am the School Mental Health Lead for the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. This is a co-hosted webinar with the National Coordinating Office. We are a new initiative of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration has divided us up into 10 regions to support no to low-cost mental health technology transfer technology, which kind of means technical assistance. So folks who are interested in webinars, in issue briefs, in intensive learning experiences, all to support the workforce development of the mental health field, and particularly in this case, the school mental health workforce, which Jessica will be talking about in a little bit. And I just want to point out that we serve the Pacific Southwest region. We're really focused on supporting the mental health workforce, which is all of you, in thinking about the ways that we can get stronger and better and really work collaboratively to support those who are experiencing need and also those who provide support in need. I'm going to transfer it to Jessica. If you can unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about the School Mental Health Supplement.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Jessica Gonzalez, and I am the Project Associate for the School Mental Health Supplement, part of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network Coordinating Office. So last year in August, the MHTTC network received supplemental funding from SAMHSA to address the need for further implementation of mental health services in school systems. And so through the supplement, our centers have planned many school mental health specific activities, disseminating information on school mental health services to holding learning events to build awareness and skills. Our centers are working hard to expand training and technical assistance around the implementation of school-based mental health services. And these planned activities are centered around several important topics, including assessment, intervention, trauma-informed care, cultural competence, as well as financing and sustaining school mental health services, just to name a few. And this national webinar that we are hosting today is an example of one of the many activities that our centers put on.
Thanks, Jessica. I want to remind us that we have a ton of offerings, as I said at the top, no-cost training, technical assistance, and resources that you can access if you are not in the Pacific Southwest region, that you can access your own MHTTC, and we'll be giving that contact information at the end. One of the services that we provide are webinars, which all of you are on, and we are on today, and what brings us together to do a really kind of important learning session on how to support young people who are students in either the immediate aftermath or the long-term aftermath in crisis and navigating grief. So I'm going to transfer the mic, so to speak, to David Schoenfeld to introduce himself and the center. And I do want to say before the transfer happens that if you have questions, comments, resources, or ways in which what David is presenting you have experienced in your own practice and you want to provide folks with a modeling or an example, please do include that in the chat box so that we can create this experience to be as interactive and as lively as possible. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to David.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to everyone. So my name is David Schoenfeld. I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician, and I direct the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, which is located at the University of Southern California, Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work. I also have an appointment in pediatrics, and I'm faculty also at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. So what I'm going to be talking with you today is really how do you support children as students and also staff in schools in the aftermath of both crisis and loss. So I'm going to start by giving you a brief introduction to the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, and then I'm going to turn to how do you support students after a crisis event. And I should say that although I'm going to be talking about different crisis events we've been involved in that are of some national significance, you can use the same approaches if you're dealing with a student who has a personal or a family crisis. So there's no reason to wait to use any of these strategies. You can use them every day in school settings. I'm going to summarize some of the symptoms of adjustment reactions that you may see for individuals who are coping with a crisis or a loss, and then turn to the timeline for adjustment. What are the phases that people go through before they ultimately cope with these events? And then I'm going to turn to staff support and professional self-care, and then spend a little bit of time on supporting the grieving student and highlight the Coalition to Support Grieving Students materials, which are available online and free. So first I'm going to start with just introducing you to the National Center, since most of you have probably not been familiar with it before. The center was established with funding from the September 11th Children's Fund back in 2005, and the core funding is now provided by the New York Life Foundation. And the center was created to promote an appreciation of the role that schools can serve to support students, staff, and families at times of both crisis and loss, to enhance the training of individuals in school-related professional education programs in the areas of both crisis and loss, and then to serve as a resource for information, training materials, consultation, and technical assistance. And the immediate technical assistance that we provide is provided at no cost to the school or to the individual who's contacting us, and I'll tell you how to contact us. But you can call for advice, and we will provide that assistance at no charge. This slide just summarizes some of the services that we provide. We have an interdisciplinary team of medical, mental health, and school professionals, and we provide confidential on-site as well as remote technical assistance and consultation, generally for school leadership and professionals in schools. We provide practical and timely advice, and we have a 24/7 toll-free number as well as email, and actually after hours, the phone number is answered by Children's Hospital Los Angeles hospital operators, so that you should be able to reach us at any time. We also, though, provide ongoing support not just in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, but also throughout the long-term recovery period. We've worked with some schools and districts for anywhere from 5 to 10 years or longer. And I should say that the work I'm going to be describing really started back over 30 years ago. Even though the center was formally established in 2005, we had a program on the East Coast that was funded beginning in about 1991. So it's really a long time. We also do offer educational resources and crisis management tools, and we do provide school staff training and community presentations. We offer professional development for a range of different professional audiences. And that'll become a little clearer when I talk about the coalition at the end. So people often ask, where have we been? And so I'm just going to summarize some of the schools and communities we've worked with recently. And these schools and districts have all given permission to have their name included. So as I mentioned, we coordinated the training for New York City schools after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001. And that was really the impetus for the funding of the center, so that other schools and communities could have resources to the support we provided. We've worked with a lot of communities around school shooting. I just returned last week and will be going back shortly to Parkland, Florida. We've been working with Broward County Public Schools after the shooting that happened there. We also responded and helped coordinate the first week response for the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, as well as responded to the community shooting in Las Vegas, Nevada, the school shooting in Benton, Kentucky, the shooting at the Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks, California. We work there with a community college and community-based individuals. The school shooting in Spokane, Washington, in Marysville, Washington, in Corning, California, in Aurora, Colorado, the shooting in the movie theater, as well as the school shooting in Platte Canyon, Colorado, Chardon, Ohio, Townville, South Carolina, and many others. We also, though, do respond to natural disasters, and that would include Hurricane Maria in San Juan, Sandy in New York and New Jersey, Katrina in New Orleans, as well as Ike in Galveston, Texas, and tornado destruction in Joplin, Missouri, as well as Alabama in 2011, and then wildfire destruction in Sonoma County, California, in Sevier County, Tennessee, and in Butte County, California. I'm actually returning there tomorrow. So most of our work has been in the United States, but we do some international work as well. We responded to the Akita Elementary stabbing in Osaka, Japan, as well as the earthquake in Sichuan Province, China. But most of the work that we do internationally is either done remotely. So, for example, we provided some assistance after the Taliban attack at the school in Peshawar, Pakistan. But most of the time when we're doing the work in person, it's usually at professional meetings. And so these are some of the countries I've presented at on this topic. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the center, and I'm going to move on now to tell you a little bit about what we actually do consult, because it varies by school. We try and help meet the needs of the school and the community, both the short term and the long term. So just as an example for the short term, we often prepare scripts for teachers so they have something to read on the first day back in class. We can often turn that around quickly. I think my record's been 20 to 30 minutes. Someone calls at 11 o'clock at night, so they have something for the next morning. We prefer a little bit more notice, but we understand that's not always possible. But we also do long-term work. And so we advise often the Board of Education, the cabinet, the superintendent, on how do you build sustainable systems that actually endure past the grant funding. Because we find that often the grant funding time period is insufficient for the recovery period, and we don't want the loss of the supports because of the money being depleted to be an incremental loss for the community. We advise on models of crisis mental health services, staffing, training, and policies, and do provide some of the training when requested. A lot of our work, to be honest, is around staff support. I remember talking to one principal. They had a community shooting, and I came out to the school and did some in-service training for the entire school staff. And the community shooting actually involved recent graduates, and it was at a party at someone's home. So as I was doing the in-service training, one of the things I talked about is guilt, and I'll be getting to that later in this presentation. And the principal spoke to me afterwards, and he said, when you mentioned that, it really resonated, because we had 3 students who died by suicide a couple of years ago, and there were a number of staff that told me if I was a better principal, those kids might still be alive. He said, I've had to live with that guilt for several years. We find we spend a lot of time really working one-on-one and providing support to leaders in these events, because it can be very challenging to be able to lead effectively after a crisis or disaster. Sometimes it's even human resource issues that come up, whether it's about reassignment of staff who are struggling in their current roles. I went to one school that had a school shooting, and there was only one mental health provider, and that mental health provider was locking her door and crying during the day. And I had to work with her to make sure that she took some leave and took care of herself, and then also they could bring someone else in to support the students. A lot of our time is spent preparing the schools and the school professionals to address the educational impact and to put in place the academic supports that are needed. We have even drafted letters to go out with college applications that explain the temporary impact on academics and how to review these applications in an appropriate way. And we spend a lot of time just talking with teachers about basic academic accommodations. We do a lot of work on suicide postvention, and a lot of our work is in commemoration and memorialization. We actually did the training for all of the staff at the 9/11 Memorial the weekend before they opened, as well as the docents at the 9/11 Museum, staff at the Flight 93 Museum. But we work with schools. So I'll give you one example of when that of how that can be very relevant even on the short term. We were contacted by one school about a suicide that had occurred by train. And we explained to the school that often spontaneous memorials are placed right at the scene of the death, and that we asked them to make sure that they went there and made sure that, because it was in a wooded area, that there was not an unsupervised gathering of students who were grieving, because often in those sites there's alcohol and other drug use, depressed or sad individuals, and ready access to a lethal means of suicide. So we talked about making sure that they go to the site and that they relocate any objects that have been left there. So that's just a very brief summary of what it is that we do. It varies, quite honestly, a lot based on what the school and the school district and the community is needing. This is our website, schoolcrisiscenter.org. You can go there for information and free materials. And you'll see it says, I need help now or help me prepare, and you pick one of those and you get different resources. So what I wanted to do now was tell you a little bit about our overall philosophy and then get into the topic. One of the things that we try and make sure to emphasize is that we really feel that you need to make sure that you're helping your staff all be able to support children. So it is not that we are asking teachers, classroom teachers, to be therapists or counselors, but we know that research has demonstrated that connectedness is a vital protective factor for children, and often what we're trying to do is to make sure that the school staff, including the classroom educators, can convey what I call an empathic presence to students. So I'm going to show you this first video, about 90 seconds long.
2 years ago, I had a student come back from a funeral, and the kids told me that his mother was in the hospital and that's why he hasn't been at school. I said, oh, okay. So then when he came back, I said, Jonathan, he said, my mom passed. I had no idea. No one warned me. And I said, Jonathan, And I hugged him, and then I looked at him, and I was going to lose it because my heart, your mother, you know. And he looked at me and he goes, Jackie, please don't. And I said, okay. So he didn't want to talk about it. And the only thing I let him know is, when you're ready, I'm here. And we're all here for you. And my door is always open. And, you know, maybe 3 weeks later, he came to me and said, thank you. And I look up from my desk, what are you thanking me for? He said, I just want you to know, thank you. And I said, you know, Jonathan, you're welcome. And I don't know what I did. He goes, you were here and I didn't have to talk about it. So I realized then, you know, I wish I realized that sooner. Sometimes you don't want to talk about it. You want to be somewhere where you can forget that you're grieving. So I think you have to, as an educator, it's like a dance. I'm going to take a step forward. If you start the dance with me, I can take the next step. If they stop and they're not able to, okay, we can stay here and just listen to the music.
So one of the things I think you'll see from this educator's comments is that a lot of what you need to do is to just be present with the children in an empathic and sympathetic way. And that I really like her characterization that it's like a dance, and that sometimes you just stand there and listen to the music together, and that means a whole lot to kids. So in the immediate aftermath of a major crisis event, we talk about often providing psychological first aid. And that's something that is given to everyone that's been impacted by the event, and it involves offering psychoeducation and supportive services to foster effective and normative coping strategies and adjustment. It is just to accelerate the natural healing process. All the adults working with children should understand the likely reactions and how to help children cope. Because the reality is anyone that interacts with children can be a potential source of assistance and support. But if they're unprepared, particularly if they are perceived to be uncaring, they can actually become a source of further distress. The reality is that many people in the school have access to children in different ways. I went to one school that had gone through a hostage situation and one of the students was murdered during the rescue attempt. And I was talking to the cafeteria workers and they told me they were concerned that the girls were wearing long-sleeve shirts. And when I asked them why that was concerning to them, they said, well, when they hold out their trays, the sleeves retract and we can see that they've been cutting more. And we know they're wearing long-sleeve shirts to cover that. And so I asked them if they were telling the mental health providers, and they said, well, no, we're cafeteria workers. No one asked us to do that. So often you will find that other staff have important observations about children. I also talked to the custodians in that school, and they told me that they were concerned that the kids were now out of control. So I asked one of the custodians, give me an example of what you mean by out of control behavior that you observed. And he said, well, the other day I was walking through the cafeteria, and a group of high school students got up and they left their trays. I reminded them, but they kept walking. So I stopped them, and I said, if you don't pick up those trays, no one else is going to. So the kids went over, they picked up the trays, they walked to the door, and they threw them out of the building. They turned to the custodian and said, okay, are you happy now? They're not on the table anymore. And the custodian just looked at me and said, these are good kids. They never would have done that prior to the shooting. But what concerns me most is they would never do that in front of the administration, in front of the teachers, or in front of their parents. We see a very different side of these kids, and we're really worried about them. One of the other custodians told me that they knew that the kids were having sex on campus during school hours. They told me they knew who and they knew where. So the issue is that there are going to be many adults on campus who have access to students in different ways. And we need all of them to be able to be supportive and to be able to help them. So one of the first steps in the timely identification of the kids that might benefit from additional services is to look for any signs or symptoms of adjustment difficulties, some of which are listed on this slide. The most common symptom, though, I'll get to this later, is none. A lot of times individuals who have significant psychological distress may not show it, and I'll come back to why that's the case. So if you have individuals that have had severe trauma exposure or very significant loss, we should be providing support to them even if they don't appear to be having difficulty, or at least offering it to them. But Let me go over some of the symptoms that you can look for. So one of them is sleep problems. That can be trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, frequent wakening, or difficulty wakening, or nightmares. Any disruption in sleep can also lead to disruption in work performance. For kids, that's learning in school. For teachers, that's teaching. So we want to make sure that we promote good sleep hygiene in children and adults after these events to maximize the opportunity for them to get a good night's sleep. I've done this work for over 30 years. I've actually never prescribed medication for sleep in an individual who has had sleep problems due to crisis or loss. There are some unusual situations where that might be quite appropriate, but when I'm talking about attending to sleep problems, I'm really making sure that you're doing good sleep hygiene to increase the chances that kids and adults will get a good night's sleep. You may also see separation anxiety and school avoidance. A lot of times kids who have been through difficult events, whether that happened at home or whether that happened at school or elsewhere, may still be reluctant to separate from parents and other loved ones to come to school. And the parents also have difficulty letting them go because they also feel concerned about their safety. So children may be afraid that something will happen to their parents if they're not there somehow to protect them, or that something will happen to them if they're not there with their parents for their parents to protect the children. So what I tell people is after there's been a school crisis, you want to try and get kids back to a school-like setting as soon as possible to the extent that they can tolerate and with the supports that they need to make it tolerable. It may not be the same school or the same classroom. It may only be for half an hour in the beginning, but you want to make that transition back into a school-like setting as soon as possible rather than just staying home for an indefinite period of time. Now, kids may also develop both general anxiety and trauma-related fears. So they may become fearful of something that reminds them of the event. So if it's a school shooting, they may become afraid of loud noises, for example. And I think most people understand that and anticipate that. But children may also just become more anxious. So they may, for example, be afraid of the dark even if the event happened during daylight. Children and adults may also become more irritable and have difficulties with concentration, which can lead to a deterioration in academic performance. We sometimes see teachers estimating 2 to 3 years loss in academic abilities, at least for a short period of time. Children may also demonstrate regression, and a lot of times people are familiar with the developmental regression, a 5-year-old who now becomes clingy when left at kindergarten. But you can also see social regression. The children may become more demanding, more selfish, may have more difficulty getting along with peers or family members. Sometimes it looks like they don't care. And paradoxically, we have to recognize that this is often a sign that they're under stress and having difficulty coping. So they may not really be able to attend to the needs of others if they're still struggling to meet their own needs and adjust and cope themselves. I went to one major natural disaster, and I was talking to parents before a presentation I was doing in the evening on the first day back to school. And I asked one of the parents how old their children was, just casually. And she said, well, actually, I have a number of kids, but there are 2 I'm most concerned about. One is 5 and one is 35. And she just said, I'm most worried about the 35-year-old. Her husband was standing right next to her. He picked up one of the children, started crying, and left the room. The issue is that these difficulties are not just with the children. In fact, I often find the adults are more impacted than the children are. And that type of regressive behavior can be seen in adults, even among professionals. When we go into schools, we don't ask if the teachers are yelling at the kids. We just ask, has the yelling started to decrease yet? So we have to expect that you will also see some of these reactions in the adults. You may see among the kids and adults sadness and depression. And you may also see an onset of or an increase in substance abuse. That can be tobacco, alcohol, or other substance use. I went to respond to the earthquake in China in Sichuan province. And I was visiting with the staff of a school that had been destroyed by the earthquake. So it was a middle school, and approximately 40% of the students and staff were killed when the building collapsed, and the other 60% were trapped under the rubble and dug out. So I was in a resettlement community standing in a tent. And I asked one of the teachers how the kids were doing, and he said, well, they're middle school kids, so they've been smoking more tobacco. And then I asked him how he was doing, and without even pausing, and even though his principal was standing next to him, he just said, I drink every night to go to sleep. So you need to make sure that when you have your crisis response plans in place, that you're also thinking about how you're going to evaluate and manage substance abuse. Because if you don't look for it, you may not find it, but that often does increase. Another common symptom of adjustment reactions is somatization. Many of the children and families who would benefit most from supportive services or counseling after a major crisis are not going to identify their difficulties as psychological or emotional in nature, but instead they may present with physical symptoms. So we find that we're often working a lot with school nurses to help them because they have to deal with a large increase in demand for their services. And what makes it tricky is not only do you see an increase in psychological distress presenting as physical symptoms, but you see an increase in physical illness because of the stress hormones. So you may see worsening of high blood pressure, of asthma attacks, of diabetes. So individuals will present with both, and both of those categories tend to be seen by school nurses. Now, this slide goes over some of the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that you will see. And to qualify for the diagnosis of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, children must have had exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Now, that can be through direct experiencing. They were in a car accident and they were injured, or they may be a direct witness of the event. But in children, it also permits that they may learn about the event having occurred to a close family member or friend, even if they were not physically present. So a child who is notified about the death of a parent by a car accident that occurred in another state several days ago may still qualify for the exposure component of PTSD. So I think we have to be cautious that we don't overdiagnose PTSD because some of the other reactions that children have may look similar, although children, of course, can get PTSD from something they've been notified about. But we have to make sure we don't try and explain everything as being trauma. So they have to have symptoms in the following 4 core areas, and all 4 of them, and they have to be present for at least 1 month. That doesn't mean that we wait for a month until we provide support. It's just they're acute reactions to begin with. But before we call it PTSD, it has to be present for a month. So the first category is re-experiencing of the traumatic event. That can be through recurrent, intrusive, and distressing memories or dreams. Now in children, the frightening dreams may be sufficient. If they tell you they've had frightening dreams, even if they don't remember or recognize the content of the dreams. They do not require the dissociative reactions or the flashbacks which you may see. And you may also see in children trauma-specific reenactment occurring in play, and that's called post-traumatic play. So the reason I bring that up is just because kids are playing about what happened doesn't mean that they're actually resolving it. They may actually be reenacting it. Now, I'm going to talk about other types of reactions that may appear to look like post-traumatic reactions, and so one of them is bereavement. So a child who has had a parent die in a car accident, for example, may actually have frightening dreams afterwards. That is not uncommon. The second criteria is avoidance of stimuli. That's even thoughts or feelings associated with the trauma. And that's a core symptom of PTSD and reminds us that we need to inquire about or screen actively for PTSD. Otherwise, kids, even if they know they have had difficulties and know they're having trauma symptoms, may not come forward and ask for help because in order to come forward, they have to think about and talk about what's happened, and that's very difficult for them. Now, kids also don't want to think and talk about their grief either. So again, a bereavement that is not related to PTSD may also give the sense or the appearance of meeting these criteria unless you're careful. The third criteria is negative alterations in cognitions and mood that are associated with the traumatic event, such as having a distorted understanding of the cause leading to guilt, or it could just be intense feelings of fear, horror, anger, or shame. And I'm going to talk more about guilt later, and that's so common, whether it's in crisis or in situations of loss, that I'm not sure that this discerns a great deal. And then the last criteria is increased arousal, and that might be difficulty concentrating or sleeping, irritability or anger, or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, or an exaggerated startle. And some of this increased arousal, such as trouble concentrating or sleeping and irritability, can be seen in children who are grieving as well. So my point is not to underemphasize the importance of post-traumatic reactions and disorders, but simply to say that as you look for this actively, please also be careful to make sure that you don't assume that everything that happens after a traumatic event is a trauma symptom or trauma disorder. There actually are a far wider range of reactions and concerns after a major crisis event beyond post-traumatic symptoms and disorders. For those children who had a family member or friend die as a result of the crisis, bereavement may actually be their predominant problem, as I already alluded to. I was talking with one young man after a community shooting, and the person on either side of him had been shot and killed. He had gone back to school once, stayed for an hour or two, and returned home, and otherwise was not communicating much with the school. The person on either side of him at the event that he was at was shot and killed. So he clearly had a strong traumatic exposure. And after about 3 weeks when I was visiting there, I got permission from him by text to come to his home, and I asked him why I wasn't getting counseling. And he said he didn't really feel the need for it, that he had had some trauma symptoms for the first week, that he had trouble sleeping, concentrating, he was jittery, he reacted to loud noises, and he said, but that only lasted for about a week, and he was better. So I asked him why he didn't leave his home, and he said, I leave my home every day. I just go out and I'm with my friends who were there at the event because they understand what happened. And then he looked at me and said, I'm going camping this week, and I don't know why everyone thinks I'm scared. So then I asked him why he was not in school, and he said he went there, but it didn't seem right to be there. And I asked why it wasn't right, and he explained it wasn't right to be there without his girlfriend. He had been at an event with his girlfriend, and he planned on marrying her. And he said being at school without her just didn't feel right. So I looked at him and I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend then. And he looked surprised because no one had suggested that in the 3 weeks. And he said, that's it. And if someone wants to talk about that, I'll go for counseling right now. I just don't want to keep talking about the shooting. So the issue is that sometimes it's bereavement, but it may not even be bereavement. So you can have trauma, you can have bereavement, but you may also have additional reactions. So a crisis often initiates a cascade of secondary losses and stressors. So if there's a natural disaster, for example, there might be a relocation that's forced on a lot of the families. And that means the kids often lose their peer network. They may have academic failure and trouble integrating into their new social network. And natural disasters and family crises, whether they be from violence or not, may lead to financial stresses, parental stress, parental mental health problems may worsen, and you may see marital conflict or domestic violence. And any of these stressors may be the predominant stressor for the child and family. So we don't want to focus solely on post-traumatic symptoms from an event immediately surrounding the crisis. You need to explore how they're doing in light of current stressors. So I was in Sonoma after the wildfires, and I was talking to a group of pediatricians, and they told me that they made sure that every patient they saw, they asked if their home was destroyed. And I said, well, that's a good question, and you should ask it, but it may not tell you everything. So I gave an example of when I was in New Orleans on one of the visits after Katrina. One of the teachers told me that she had rented an apartment in the French Quarter when the hurricane had hit, and that she actually suffered no damage to her apartment, no flooding, no wind damage. She said, we were very lucky. She said, we were lucky for about 3 or 4 months, and then my lease ran out. Because there was so little affordable housing in New Orleans, in the area, my landlord doubled the lease, and I no longer could afford it. She said, but I couldn't find anything nearby, so I had to travel about 45 minutes away. She said to me, she said, I'm basically living out of the trunk of my car. But that also meant she had to pull her daughter out of high school. Her daughter became depressed. She ended up in an emergency room and on antidepressants. She wasn't really able to arrange for the counseling. I don't know if it was the transportation, the expense, the lack of access, but she said she wasn't able to get the counseling arranged. So someone recommended a pet. So she went out and she got a dog, and the dog attacked someone in the throat. And the teacher looked at me and she said, I'm going to court next week, and my attorney tells me there's a good chance I'll be bankrupt. So this woman did not experience anything that traumatic when Katrina hit. It's just everything that followed that was really devastating to her. So we have to, unfortunately, not just look at what happened in the one event, but we have to look at what followed. And then to make it even more complicated, a crisis of any nature often awakens feelings related to a pre-existing or even a past crisis that wasn't fully resolved. It may now assume a primary focus for a particular child or adult, and that may occur even if the events are completely unrelated. I had done some training in Las Vegas for some schools prior to the shooting. One of them called me up. The shooting happened on Sunday night. They called me up on Monday. They said, we already have a student down in the office, and she's crying because her mother has cancer and she's afraid she's going to die. She wasn't at the concert. The girl didn't know anyone who had died, and in fact, I don't think there was anyone in the school that knew anyone personally who had died in that shooting, and none of them appeared to have been there. But this girl, just seeing news coverage of grieving individuals, made her worry about her mother's illness in a way she hadn't felt as much before. Now, with all of that going on, you would imagine that everyone's upset, and everyone knows that. But actually, parents and other adults that support children, whether that be teachers or parents, tend to underestimate the extent of children's reactions to a crisis situation, especially when it's related to how they feel internally and when it's not visible. So this was one of the posters that Project Liberty put up about 6 months after 9/11 in New York City. They all had the same tagline, if only the signs were this easy to read, because often they're not. Children may attempt to withhold complaints of these symptoms because of concerns that it makes them somehow abnormal, or they're just inappropriate, or because they wish to protect their parents or other adults who are also visibly upset. Children can also sense when adults are made uncomfortable by their questions or comments, so they stop asking them. But parents and other adults may be aware of the symptoms, but still fail to report them because they may not think professionals are interested in hearing about them. There is a tendency in some of the lay literature to refer to reactions that people have in these events as being normal reactions to an abnormal event. But I would argue if they're normal reactions, why would you tell anyone about them? So I think the messaging has to be a little more nuanced. The way I usually explain it to people is that even psychologically healthy individuals, such as themselves, when they find themselves in a situation as difficult as this, may experience significant distress. Fortunately, we have someone here that can talk with you, or I can refer you to someone who can talk with you to assist you with that distress. And then I just ask, do I have permission to bring that person in? I think people are much more likely to say yes to that than if you say, well, it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Do you think you need counseling? So again, I understand there's stigma related to mental illness, and we need that persists even if it's a national crisis. And we want to normalize help seeking. But I think we have to be cautious not to suggest that all of the reactions are just so common that they are just normal, because then I don't think it really encourages people to accept assistance. The question that I then get is, okay, we've had this event, when do we go back to the way we were? And I tell them, well, that's easy, never. These are life-changing events. We don't get over them, and they don't go away. We have to incorporate them into ourselves and move forward despite these events. But then people ask, okay, well, what is the timeline? So this is the general process. For each person, we have a certain baseline of coping and adaptation, and it is not a straight line. So from A to B, there is some ups and some downs. There's a tendency for people to look at times when people are having difficulty in coping and say that they're experiencing the trauma and that they're in crisis. Well, distress does not mean crisis. And actually, events are not defined as crisis events in isolation. A crisis event is something that the individual or the group or system or community is unable to cope with in the absence of external support. The reason I mention that is resilience is not necessarily meaning that the person doesn't feel distress. It just means that the person's capable of coping with the distress without external support. But they still should get our support. We should not make people suffer by themselves if we can give them assistance to help them cope more effectively or more quickly. But let's say a crisis event has occurred and it's overwhelmed the person's capacity to cope. So by point C, they're feeling vulnerable, and point D, their usual coping mechanisms have failed. If this is a major event that is publicly known, it does not occur this way when it's a personal or family crisis. It's unknown to the school or to peers. But if it's a major event at point D, when people are at their worst, communities usually come together. And what you will see is that they share food, they share stories, they share concern. And there is a palpable difference in these communities, that they come together and they support each other, and there is some improvement. Some people have actually called this a honeymoon phase. I don't like that term. It suggests that marriage is a disaster, which I think has its own proponents. So I kind of prefer to just call it, an initial recovery phase. But what will happen is people do come together, and this is where it gets tricky. In fact, as people start to improve is when they're most vulnerable to hurt themselves. Suicides after major natural disasters don't usually happen on the day of the event. They usually happen in the weeks to months that follow. When I was in New Orleans on one of my visits after Katrina, it was about 4 months after the hurricane, and I was talking to healthcare providers, and they could list people they knew who had died by suicide. There was actually a supplement to Pediatrics, the professional journal, dedicated to a young pediatrician who killed himself after Katrina. Now, what seems to happen is that as people start to do somewhat better, some will question their ability to ever return to their baseline or an acceptable quality of life. And that is where some people do harm themselves. Now, most children do not harm themselves. And so suicide is an uncommon occurrence, but I have seen it occur. What tends to happen instead is that people see kids doing better, and they presume that their natural resilience will bring them back to the point where they're all better. And that is a mistake. If you withdraw the support too soon, some individuals will not actually return to their baseline. They just establish a new baseline, which I just call here continued impairment. What we have to do is to continue the support until they've at least reached their baseline level of coping, and then if they get enough support and they have enough internal resilience, they may actually exceed that baseline, and that's what we call post-traumatic growth. In post-traumatic growth, one of the things to keep in mind is that although that is the better outcome that you can have after you've experienced the crisis, obviously it's best not to have the trauma or the crisis. Most people would gladly give up whatever growth they've had just to get the person back that died during the event that they care about, or to not have experienced that trauma. So I'm not in any way saying that that is a good outcome. It's just a better outcome of the different options. So let me give you an example. I was talking to a group of foster parents about how to support their foster children after a natural disaster. And one of the dads just raised his hand and he said, I think that's me. I've gone through post-traumatic growth, and I'm not familiar with the concept. And so what he explained was that he was married. He had a young child, a toddler. He was happily married and young and very successful financially in finance, and everything was going well until his kid died of an infection. And he said, all of a sudden, I really started to question what I was doing. He said, in particular, I started to question my career. I was making lots of money in finance, and I was successful from all external characteristics that people look at, but I really didn't feel it was valuable. And he said, so I quit my job, even though I was making a lot of money, and I went back to college to become a kindergarten teacher. He said, shaping the lives of young children, that's a career. I can devote myself to that. I don't care if I make a lot of money. And then he said, and then I became a foster parent, and I'm adopting a young child. He said, so I must have gone through post-traumatic growth. What you will see is many people in mental health, in education, probably particularly early education, see it all the time in pediatrics. They go into the helping profession because something happened during their childhood. Either someone helped them and they want to help others, or someone didn't, and they want to make sure that others do better. The problem with post-traumatic growth is it's something that trauma and loss can be uncovered when you help others. So the very thing that puts you into the helping profession may be the thing that's most likely to hurt you from helping others. So we need to recognize it's distressing to be with children who are in distress. And it's really critical that staff and other school professionals in general find ways to have their own personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting children who are either grieving or traumatized. It's really hard to feel like you're helping people when they're crying and upset, even when you are. I remember talking to one superintendent. He had stayed after I did a presentation to talk with me, and he was from another country, so no one in the United States, and there had been a large bus accident and a number of students had died. And he said, it's been a year or two, and I actually was upset at first, and then I did better, and then the trial came up, the anniversary came up, another death happened, and he looked at me and he goes, it still bothers me that these kids died. And he just looked at me, kind of tearful, and he said, maybe I should just retire from being superintendent. And I looked at him and I said, if you ever wake up one day and you don't actually care if the kids live, then that's when you should retire. And that, in my opinion, is a pretty low bar for someone that works with children, that you just care if they survive or not. We should care more than that. We owe it to them to care more than that. So the problem is not the caring. The problem is, what do we do with that care so it doesn't hurt us? So we need to create a culture in our professions as well as in schools in general where, frankly, it's just okay to be upset about something that is upsetting, and where members normalize asking for help and model a willingness to accept assistance. You have to learn how to take care of your colleagues and to take care of yourself. So this next slide just outlines some of the ways we can support staff. So we can provide organizational support. Sometimes it's just practical things like substitute teachers. In the immediate aftermath of or around the time of a trial or anniversary, sometimes they just need to be taken care of so that they can step out of the classroom and check on their own home. I remember I went to New Orleans after Katrina on one visit, and someone told me that they were in the middle of service, and during the sermon, somebody's cell phone went off, and people made a lot of noise. And then finally, the minister stopped the sermon, turned to the audience, and said, "You know what? That might be your contractor. You better answer the call." The person looked at me and said, "The minister really gets us. He knows what we're going through." And that's what you want. You want people to be able to understand that you do get what's important to them. And one way that schools do that is by providing substitute teachers so that teachers can be relieved to take care of their own homes or to take care of kids they're worried about or just to decompress and be able to compose themselves. Sometimes what you can do if you can't do substitute teachers is to start co-teaching in classes, assign student teachers, trained parent volunteers. Look for ways to ease the burden on the staff. You can modify the workload and the expectations. Same is true for physicians and mental health providers. And sometimes, particularly for clinical professionals, I find providing supportive supervision is what they need most. So you may have a mental health provider in the school that's now got a large increase in caseload and complexity and feels just overwhelmed. And being able to talk with someone, often from outside the system, to just help them prioritize and make sure that they're doing the best that they can be very supportive for them. You can also increase professional development on this topic, and that's what we're doing today. And then there are formal employee assistance programs, which are also a helpful aid for your staff. You also need to build up some of the natural supports that adults receive, and that may be through family and peer support. So I've done a number of times where I've done presentations and gatherings where I've had the significant others accompany the school staff. And I remember at one of the kindergarten or elementary school teachers looked at her husband and said, "You know, I actually feel safer when I'm at school where the shooting happened than when I'm home alone with you at night." And her husband just said, "How could you say that? Why?" And she said, "When I'm in school, I'm taking care of the kids, and I'm distracted. But I get home at night, and it starts to sink in what happened, and it's dark, and I'm with my thoughts, and I get scared. And I tell you that, and you tell me there's no reason to be scared. It didn't even happen here. You're perfectly safe at home." And she just looked at me and goes, "That is the last thing I want to hear from you." Now, that was actually, they had a great relationship, you could tell, because then he said, "And that is why I am here. I want to know what to say, and I really don't know how to help you." So you want to build those natural supports. And I also bring staff together for social reasons during the recovery period, including just over the summer break, because if they don't see each other, sometimes it's harder to get back together. And the informal support that occurs in schools, even after school shootings, may actually be what's supporting the teachers. So I've spent most of the time talking about crisis, and now in the last 20 minutes or so, I'm going to just focus on what do we do about bereavement. Well, first off, loss through bereavement is common in the lives of kids. The vast majority of children, about 9 out of 10, are going to experience the death of a family member or friend by the time they complete high school. 5% of children in the United States experience the death of a parent by 16 years of age. Now, this high frequency of loss for children is unfortunately contrasted by the limited preparedness of classroom educators and other school staff to support grieving students. A survey done by the American Federation of Teachers found that 93% of classroom educators have never received any training in how to support a grieving student. 93%, I believe, said they would participate in a 2 or 3 hour training if it were offered at their school, but only 3% reported that such training was actually offered or available in their district. Only 1% had gotten anything in college or graduate school. Now, although most children will adjust to even a major loss, it doesn't mean that they don't grieve, and it doesn't mean that grieving isn't extremely difficult. Bereavement has a significant and an often long-term impact on learning, social emotional development, behavior, and adjustment of children of all ages. So I'm going to show you this video, and we'll be back afterwards.
I think loss is something that's very hard to describe in words.
I wasn't paying attention in class a lot, and whenever they would ask me a question, I would be spaced out.
Once or twice I would bring up my dad, And everybody would be like, oh, do you want to talk about something else? A lot of people stayed away from me and didn't really talk to me a lot.
A lot of my teachers actually did not do a lot, which was not helpful at all. It makes you feel kind of awkward, makes you feel very, very alone.
Teachers don't understand that even though it was a long time ago, it's still really hard for me.
All the books that you pick up and read talk about how to handle a student in the first year, but very rarely do they address, okay, now this year is done, how are we going to handle them for the rest of the time? Because it doesn't go away and kids don't get over it.
There was no training for loss or tragedy in my principalship training, and I always felt as if it was something that was really needed.
I think that some part of the lesson plan should be geared toward understanding grief, understanding when a parent dies, how the child may feel.
It's really important that the student kind of be guided to where they can go just in case they need to talk to someone.
You want to make sure that you are providing support to students, even if they don't appear to be grieving. What tends to happen in our society is that adults may actually communicate unwittingly that death is not to be discussed. A child comes up and mentions to someone that a family member has died, and the individual looks away or discontinues the conversation. And unfortunately, the same thing happens in families, even more so. So what can happen is that, let's say, a parent dies in an accident, and the surviving parent notifies the child, and the child turns around and says, does that mean that Mommy's not going to be here for my birthday? And then Dad starts crying. And kids are pretty egocentric, and they may just conclude that they caused their parent to cry by misbehaving. And they'll just, they'll say, don't worry, Dad, we're going to be okay. I'll do everything that Mom did. I'll help fix things around the house. We're going to be all right. And they assume that their comments were inappropriate or naughty, and as a result, they stop them. And they may actually then turn around and support the parent who's actively grieving, which can give the false impression that the child has somehow adjusted to the loss or doesn't appreciate it. Now, there are other reasons why children may not appear to be grieving. Very young children may not yet understand what's happened, or at least not all the implications of what's happened. I remember talking to one dad whose wife died in a car accident, and he said, I live in dread of the day my daughter has her first period. Well, his daughter was 5 years old, and I assure you she was not living in dread. Now, when she does have her first period, she may acutely miss her mother, but she probably isn't going to realize that until it gets closer to that, a milestone for her. Or sometimes children actually understand quite well what's happened, but they're so overwhelmed by their feelings they don't want to talk about it because they're afraid if I talk about it, let's say with a counselor or social worker or school psychologist in school, even if it's in a private room, I've got to walk out of there and go back into math class, and I might not be able to hold it together. So sometimes they just don't want to start because they're afraid they can't handle it. Or children may express their grief indirectly through their behavior or attempt to work their feelings out through play. There actually are many games that children play where death is the theme. So one of the ones that is the first game about death occurs in every culture around the world, and it occurs in the second half of the first year of life when children start to develop object permanence. So when infants are like 2 or 3 months of age, out of sight is out of mind, and so they can't really grieve someone because they would be grieving everything all the time. But once they start to have object permanence, they can recognize that people exist even when you can't see them. They can long for reunion, and that's why kids between 6 and 9 months of age will wake up in the middle of the night crying all of a sudden because they have recognized that now they wake up like they did before, but now they realize that there are significant attachment figures and they're missing, and they cry until they're reunited. Now, at that age, children start playing the same game in every culture in the world. Here we call it peekaboo, and that's a game about death. The child fixes their gaze on someone. There's separation as if the person has died. There's heightened concern, and then an awareness, and then joy at reunion. And then they keep playing it. You have to ask yourself, why do they keep doing it over and over again? And it's because they're struggling with loss. Peekaboo, when you translate it literally from Old English, is alive or dead. And that's what the game is about. Unfortunately, most adults don't recognize that. And we really need to make sure that people know that kids are talking about this from a very young age. So I've had too many people say my child's too young to talk about this. If you played peekaboo, if you played hide and seek, you've been talking about this. It's just the adults don't recognize it. Now, sometimes children, adolescents, and adults may still choose to keep their losses as private because grief is a personal experience. So I worked with New York City schools after 9/11, and there were a number of children that made a conscious decision with their surviving parent not to inform the school that a parent had died because they didn't want to be one of the 9/11 children. So you'll find that a lot of times adults just aren't comfortable with this. And many adults don't think they know what to say to make things better, and they're often afraid they're going to say the wrong thing and unnecessarily upset children or make matters worse. But saying nothing actually says a lot, and it's all bad. It communicates that adults are unconcerned, uncaring, or unable or unwilling to be of assistance. And none of these are messages we wish to deliver to grieving children. And the silence leaves young children confused, older children and younger children unsupported, and it requires all children of all ages to grieve alone. And that isn't the message we want to deliver to kids. So when people tell me, well, I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing, I go over what are the wrong things to say. Now, these are all relatively wrong things. They're not absolutely wrong, so I'm sure there are times when it's very appropriate. And it's really in the context of you are a professional or staff person that is hired to provide support to the kid. It's different if it's your own child, if it's a peer, if it's a family member. And this is really in the context of acute grief. But the first thing is you don't want to cheer up survivors by making statements such as, I know it hurts very much right now, but I know you'll feel better within a short period of time. Anything that begins with at least should probably be reconsidered. So at least he's not in pain anymore, at least you still have a brother. What you need to do is just allow them to have their grief. You don't want to encourage them to be strong or cover their emotions. And you should feel free to express and demonstrate your own empathy and your own feelings. If you get a little tearful or a little choked up, it's fine to express that to children. If you're overwhelmed and you're not able to concentrate on the needs of the child, then it would be better to have someone else talk with that child. But if you just show some human emotion, that actually shows that you care, and that families do appreciate that. I do a lot of work with physicians, and I do explain to them that if you have a patient that dies and you actually demonstrate to the family that you're sad that the patient died, their child, they actually will assume that you cared about the kid and provided the best care possible. They don't see that as a weakness. They actually see that as a strength. Now, what you really want to do is you also want to avoid statements, by the way, if I know exactly what you're going through, because you can't. You should ask them what they're going through. You don't want to say things like you must be angry, because you don't tell people how they ought to feel. You ask them. You can say, I noticed you were yelling on the playground and you slammed the door. I'm wondering if you are angry, but you shouldn't tell them that they ought to be that way. And then this example, both my parents died when I was your age. This sharing of personal loss stories is often done by adults. And in my experience, it's usually done by adults who feel less confident in their ability in this area and often that are younger and want to show that they too have experienced this. Well, 90% of people have experienced by 18. So I think it's a pretty good assumption that if you're an adult, you've probably experienced it. You don't have to share your story to do that. Whenever you share your personal loss story, you can compete for sympathy. Either you say something that pales in comparison. I had a nurse tell a family, I know what you're going through when your infant died this weekend because my dog died this weekend. And they were deeply insulted. But you can imagine that if a child talked about his dog that died, and you said, yes, I know what you're going through, my mother just died last week, then the child has to turn around and comfort you. And this is a situation, again, the child is a client, a student, a patient. It's really all about them. It's not about your needs. So you really don't want to make the comparison because either you insult them or you draw attention away from them even in part. And it's really about meeting their needs. So I would say draw on your personal experience for comprehension and for empathy, but I would be cautious about sharing it. There are some situations where that's appropriate and helpful, but in general, I would suggest not. What you want to do is allow the child and family to be upset and tolerate unpleasant affect without trying to change it. And I would accept reactions while suspending judgment and intervene only when safety and health is a concern. If they voice suicidal or homicidal intent, that is an emergency and you take it seriously even if they are grieving. If they are drinking, as adults, you want to make sure that they have safe travel home and then someone can be with them to support them. But what you want to do is just in general try not to view it as is this normal or abnormal. Because once we tell someone it's abnormal, we've made a judgment, and it often distances them and makes it less likely that they'll accept our support. Now, one of the common reactions that you're going to see has to do with guilt, as I had mentioned. The thought processes of young children are limited in many ways, but one of them is called egocentrism. They don't know why things happen, but they assume it was done by them or because of their thoughts, wishes, feelings, actions, or lack of actions. And they see themselves as the center of the universe. And they also have limited understanding of causality, particularly as it relates to important things such as death. So if you don't know why something happened and you're egocentric, you get what we call magical thinking, where it must be something you did, didn't do, should have done, could have done that changed it. And that leads to guilt regarding death. And that magical thinking is often reinforced by parents. So I will tell you, I don't want to seem culturally inappropriate or insensitive. I raised my own children to believe in Santa Claus, and I'm also going to, for if anybody has children in the room, please keep this in mind. What I'm going to talk about is that if you convince your child that if they eat their vegetables on December 3rd, somebody in the North Pole, even though they've never been to the North Pole, is going to somehow know about that and care, even though Santa doesn't seem to really espouse a diet heavy in vegetables. And he is then going to instruct elves to make a toy of your liking, even though you haven't written the letter yet. And then it's going to be brought by, reindeer pulled by sled. I think you all know the story. So here's the spoiler alert. That's pretty far-fetched. But if you actually believe that, if you believe that that's a cause and effect relationship, then that means if you kick your sister and then 3 weeks later she gets leukemia and 2 months later she dies, that's your fault. And I would say that's actually more believable. So the magical thinking that children develop and that we encourage at some level can make them feel very powerful, and that's why it's good. The problem is when awful things happen, it makes them feel responsible. And that continues into adolescence and adulthood. So we really need to reassure children of their lack of responsibility. I have actually found, after more than 30 years, only 2 or 3 cases where I didn't find the guilt. It is so common that I actually presume it is always there. And I will say that when something bad happens, we feel badly. And when we feel badly, we often assume we did something bad. And then I'll say to children, there's nothing you did, didn't do, should have done, or could have done that would have changed this. But I still wonder if you feel that way. Kids tell me that they do. And children will then, tell me their guilt feelings, and adults will as well. So I think it's something that you really need to look for, because it appears at some level that after loss and major crisis, individuals will actually prefer, at least at an unconscious level, to assume responsibility rather than to accept that they weren't responsible, and therefore they have no control over it happening again. They can adopt an illusion of control if they accept responsibility, even if it's illogical, because they can convince themselves if they don't make the same mistake, it won't happen again. But that's just an illusion of control. It actually doesn't prevent it from happening. And furthermore, you have to deal with the guilt, and that causes a lot of difficulty with coping. I've been talking mainly about young children, and all I wanted to say for adolescents is that everything I said applies to adolescents. Adults assume that because adolescents have the ability to think rationally, that they no longer need further explanations after death, and they assume that since adolescents are often less amenable to adult guidance, that somehow they don't need our support. But in reality, adolescents do. They need information, they need our support, but they're often left unsupported. And parents often rely on adolescent children to provide comfort to them, as well as to take on more adult responsibilities to help out at home. This next slide is just to emphasize we can also provide advice on how to support children in practical ways after a death. So when a question comes up about funeral attendance, schools may be the only institution that even know that a parent has died before the funeral occurs. While their physician might give them advice, they often don't call the physician. So being prepared to at least share written information with them is important. And my recommendation is children at any age should be invited to participate in funerals and wakes and other rituals that the family participates in to the level that they wish to participate. You need to explain to them what's likely to occur, what they're likely to see, what the experience might be like for them, and then invite them to participate, but it is an invitation. I also think it's very helpful to assign a mentor to them to guide them through the process. Someone who knows the child and has a good relationship, but is not personally grieving. That might be a babysitter, it might be a neighbor, it might be a distant relative. and it might be someone from the school. You also want to be aware of community resources and offer them to families, and then provide follow-up. Check in with the child over time. You don't just offer to talk to children if they want to. You actually check back and see if they now do want to. You have to remember that grieving is long-term. In some ways, it's lifelong. And we want to follow up around the times of anniversaries, the death, the birthday of the deceased, and around special occasions. So this next video is one that shows grief triggers. And then I'm going to talk about how you do grief triggers and then just end by sharing some of the resources that are available online for you for further information.
Right now my biology class is studying blood vessels, and my dad died of an aneurysm. So we were talking about disorders, and my teacher talked about aneurysm, and she asked what could happen with an aneurysm, and I raised my hand and I told her that it could burst, and if that was in the brain it could be fatal. So we talked about that, and it's not my biology teacher's fault. It's a unit. I understand that completely. But it's a reminder of how ironic things can be sometimes. Someone can say something that's not relevant to them, but it can have a really big effect on you. Today in Spanish class, actually, my friend Kate, she's a great friend of mine, we were joking because we had a biology test the previous period, and it was a pretty hard test. So we were joking, we were saying that we were gonna get heart attacks or we were gonna pass out, and she was like, hey, I have an aneurysm. And she was like, she just kind of began shaking and stuff, and I didn't get mad at her because she didn't understand, and I hadn't told her because I just met her this year.
On a Father's Day in 3rd grade, we were making bookmarks that said father, and then we write words, and the teacher was explaining it, and I was like right about to cry because I couldn't make one. So I asked to go to the bathroom, and then I started crying in the bathroom.
Teachers look for overt signs, but grief is more subtle than that. It's not always Father's Day that's going to trigger a grief. It could be career day. It could be what does your parent do for a living that is going to trigger it.
First off, teachers and other school personnel should explain to children that it's to be expected that such triggers may occur, and then work out a safety plan with students on how to deal with the triggers when they occur so that children feel more in control and less overwhelmed. Some helpful responses might include providing a safe space or location where the student can go, such as the school social workers or counselor's room, the library, or the classroom across the hall, or an adult the child can talk to when they're feeling upset and wanting to talk. And then setting procedures for the student to obtain support, such as a signal or statement that doesn't draw attention but allows the student to leave the classroom to go to a safe space or seek support. One teacher, for example, just had the child take a tissue from the tissue box near the door and walk out the door, and she knew it was a grief trigger. You also want to provide permission and encouragement to see the school social worker, counselor, or nurse, and offer private time with the teacher to talk about thoughts, concerns, and feelings. I actually had one teacher who told me what he did was the student's father had died, and she was an adolescent, and she was allowed to wear a hoodie to school, and whenever she was feeling particularly upset in class and someone triggered her feelings, she would just put the hood up, and they called it a hoodie moment, and the teacher had already worked out he was not going to call on her during that time. But when she was ready, she would put the hood down and rejoin the class. And he said, at least she's not home grieving by herself, and she's getting something out of class. I'll respect her to set some of those limits. The reality is if kids know they can leave, they generally don't have to. Because part of what's so overwhelming about these grief triggers is that it feels overwhelming, and you feel like you're going to be out of control. And if you know you ultimately have the control and you can leave before you cry or embarrass yourself, then often they don't need to leave and the feelings pass and they're able to cope. But staff who work with children and their families should anticipate and minimize some of these likely grief triggers. So if you're going to do that exercise about Father's Day, then what you probably want to do is say to the kids, some of you may not have a father who is alive or currently living with you. That takes into account all of the other types of losses, deployment, incarceration, divorce. And you can say, you can still do this exercise thinking about your dad. Or you can pick another man in your life who was helpful, and that way we can all do this. If you have any questions, I'll come around and you can ask me about them. That would be much better than just having a child go to the bathroom and cry by themselves. And it really doesn't take much time. So I'm going to end now just in about 5 minutes, share with you some of the resources. And the first one, this is in the last video. It's a 90-second video that introduces the Coalition to Support Grieving Students material. We'll be back in about...
What will you say to a grieving child? The vast majority of children experience the death of someone close to them by the time they complete high school. So we'll all be faced with helping grieving students throughout our careers. But how many of us are ready? Less than 1 in 10 teachers have received bereavement training. Training that almost all educators say they want. Now, for the first time, a partnership has been formed to help educators support grieving students. Made up of leading professional organizations representing teachers, school administrators, mental health providers, and school counselors and support staff, the Coalition to Support Grieving Students is a unique collaboration created to share resources that will empower school communities across America to support grieving students. How? grievingstudents.org, a comprehensive web-based resource. It covers a wide range of topics to help you engage with grieving students and manage issues surrounding bereavement in a school setting. The website provides practical and accessible information and includes multiple videos in which educators, experts, and bereaved students share their knowledge and experience. Now you have the tools to give support. What will you say to a grieving child?
So that's just a brief promotional video about the Coalition material. And as I had mentioned in the video, there were 10 major school professional organizations, including school administrator organizations, both of the major teachers union, the AFT and NEA, the major organizations representing school counselors, nurses, social workers, and school psychologists. Since we launched this 4 years ago, there have been many more organizations that have joined the Coalition. We're now up to about 85, and you'll see some of them here, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Association of Independent Schools, National Resilience Institute, Boys and Girls Club of America, Save the Children, and a lot of kind of local, state, and regional organizations as well, bringing us up to, as I said, over 85. Here's the website, grievingstudents.org. If you go there, you'll find over 20 video-based training modules. Most of the videos are about 10 minutes long or even less. You don't need to register. You can just go. It's even mobile enabled, so you can watch it on your cell phone if you're in school and you just have a question. Topics are things like how to deal with guilt, how to deal with the school crisis, how to deal with suicide. What about a child who has a potentially life-limiting condition? As I said, there are over 20 of those topics. You will also get a print summary of each of the modules if you prefer to read the material. And you can order free materials. If you go to grievingstudents.org, this is one of the booklets for parents. And it's called After a Loved One Dies. It's in English and Spanish in hard copies. We also have it in Chinese and Japanese electronically. You can download the PDF, you can email it, you can photocopy it, and if you want, you can just go to the purple Order Free Materials link on grievingstudents.org, and you can order copies, and the New York Life Foundation actually pays for the shipping and handling, so it's completely free. If you want more information about the center, please contact us. I have our toll-free number here, our website, the informational email address, our Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. Like us, love us, share us, tweet us. Please share the information. And if you wish, you can also go to the website and you can click on the link that says Grief-Sensitive Schools, and you can find out how you can become a grief-sensitive school. There are 2 major ways. One is through 5 of the 7 largest districts in the country are working with us, the center, to implement this district-wide. But individual schools can also request a presentation by what we call a New York Life Ambassador. One of the members of the workforce, over 1,000 of them nationally, have been trained to go in and do an introduction about the Coalition and bring some of the free Coalition materials. They will also give a grant of $500 so that schools can pledge to be grief sensitive and then can embark on trying to make sure that they're better prepared to support grieving children. So I'm going to stop there and turn this back over to Leora.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A really powerful hour plus with you and the center. we're going to move into a couple pieces that are technology and next steps focused, which I know a lot of folks are interested in. Before we did that, I want to ask us to, in your chat box, to take a moment, quiet moment with yourself or with a colleague who might be sitting next to you, and to put in the chat box, what is one takeaway that you are walking away from this conversation? One either have to share with another colleague, something that really resonated, one takeaway that you would like to hold on to. So we've got a lot of resonance around the power of being present, the really supportive resources, the ability to be reflective both as a listener, teacher, the importance of access to resources to support staff in crisis, that grief is an ongoing process, that's right, that it doesn't just stop, and that we can check in over and over and over again. We have another resonance about just being present and being there, and that the initial stressor might be really different than unresolved grief or loss. It's a really powerful one. Thanks, Treva. Some good takeaways around all the support. This can be itself a really powerful conversation, and we want to make sure that you feel like you've got resources to make the next step. So a lot of resonance around self-care, creating space, and being resourceful. I think, David, while you were going through the slide about the timeline of distress and trigger up to post-traumatic and post-traumatic growth, that there was a lot of resonance on that particular visual, right, and some virtual head nodding on the relationship difference and connectedness between PTSD and bereavement, PTSD and grief, PTSD and trauma. So I want to continue, as you continue to put your takeaways, part of the way that we make meaning of our lives is when we, even just a simple moment of reflection gives us the ability to transition. Some of you are going to be leading your own PDs, your own meetings in the next hour, and this has been a powerful one. So we want to make sure to provide space for all of us to make meaning so that we have some regulation space to move into our next appointment on the calendar. Please keep putting your resonances in the chat box because that also helps folks find connection with virtual colleagues. I'm going to hand it to Jessica to briefly share about the MHTC network. A lot of you said that you were really feeling very supported by the resources from the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. And we want to also support you and let you know a little bit more about how you can get in contact with us for further support either with David or with other connected learning needs. So Jessica, you want to take it away?
So again, a big thank you to everyone who joined this webinar today. If this is your first time hearing about the MHTTC network, you can learn more about us by visiting our website at mhttcnetwork.org. On our website, you can find the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center that's in your area and learn more about the focus areas for each of our 12 centers. We also have a training and events calendar so that you can stay up to date on free upcoming trainings and events that are hosted across our network. And you'll also find our products and resources catalog where you can gain access to mental health and school mental health specific resources. So one of the resources, this is an example of a resource that was recently developed by the MHTTC network, and it's titled After a School Tragedy, Readiness, Response, Recovery, and Resources. And so it's intended to be a helpful resource for school administrators, educators, and school mental health professionals, as it offers strategies to assist schools in the event of a tragedy and places to turn to for more resources. It also discusses terminology and concepts related to suicide and grief and highlights the importance of providing culturally responsive services to students struggling with grief and trauma. So again, you can access this resource and learn more about the MHTTC network by visiting our website at mhttcnetwork.org. Now I'll go ahead and pass it back to Leora, who will talk a little bit about Pacific Southwest MHTTC and how you can contact them.
Yeah. Thanks, Jessica. So I also want to say before we move that resource was deeply informed by David and the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement resources. So it is a resource that is stemmed in partnership. So a little bit about us. We are, again, one of the MHTTCs. There are many of our colleagues representing other mental health technology transfer centers on the line. If you are interested in getting our monthly newsletter, which has tons of webinar learning opportunities, trainings, we produce resources, and we share resources, please sign up for our newsletter. You do not have to be part of our region for that. And you can also let us know about what you would like to learn more about in the needs assessment. We have 2 more series in our school mental health webinar series. We have one coming up around school site leadership and teacher collaboration for whole school wellness on May 16th. And we have another session on when there's one school counselor, how to support all students nevertheless, presented by school leaders in Nevada. So we really hope that you join us for the next 2 sessions. I just want to say again that you got the presentation and handout in the email at the top of the hour. In the session handouts, if you click on where it says presentation and handout, you can say download file, and you will also get a follow-up thank you email from us. You can contact us if you don't get those resources, because we know how valuable this PowerPoint deck is and how much many of us want to relearn and continue learning the content. So when I close out, we're going to have an evaluation form. The evaluation form is simply a way for us to get feedback that goes to us as a center, to the MHETC, and then to David, so that we continue to get better at presenting our learnings and our work. We really hope that you complete it so that we can continue this no-cost, low-cost support of really making sure that you feel resourced and supported doing the incredible work that all of you do. I want to close by saying a huge thank you to David and the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. I'm really inviting all of us to really send massive positive energy to David. He flies all around the country doing really, really incredible, important, and urgent work. And so we're so grateful for your time today, David, and to the Center for the powerful work that you do, and to all of you on the line for taking the time to sit with us and to learn with us. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon.